Hi, everyone. This is Brian Lawrence with an episode of the Go to Marketplace podcast/video. And I've got my friend Ben Anderson from Acryl Data here with me. Ben, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Delighted to have you. First, would you mind telling folks a little bit about Acryl Data and what the company does?
Yeah. So I'm the director of sales at Acryl Data, and we drive the open source Data Hub community. So Data Hub is the number one open source data metadata management platform. We have the largest community in the data catalog space, not only as Acryl customers, but also the open source users that are in production at amazing companies around the world. It's like Stripe and Slack, and of course, LinkedIn. That's where it was created and maintained by one of our founders, Shashanka. And so our clients use us as a data catalog to discover, govern, and observe their data.
Cool. And how about yourself, Ben? How'd you end up there at Acryl? Tell a little bit about your backstory, if you would.
Yeah. So I, as I got into sales, I had a few different sales roles, but I really fell in love with this open source business model, specifically around just open source communities. There's this notion of like a freemium tier, and that just pales in comparison to what an open source community is from a go-to-market perspective. While I was at Astronomer, I got to know the Airflow. Apache Airflow is a data pipeline project that's open source. I got to know the PMC members, like the lead contributors to the project, and meet all these data engineers. And it's just really inspiring that you have developers around the world that contribute lines of code to a project, and it's what wins. And I think it's the future for software in general, but also for companies around it, because you can iterate extremely fast on new features, because it's not just your team that's building out tools and features in the software, but it's actually the whole open source community. So, Data Hub is like over 8,000 members in the community Slack, and there's new contributors with every new release that comes out. And so just open source as like a software model, you can go all the way back to like Red Hat and see what they did by providing support. But my experience at Astronomer and seeing what's been done at Confluent with Kafka, seeing what Databricks has become, being first initially based off of Spark. So that's what really got me excited. And so when I heard about what was happening at Acryl Data, and when I learned about the Data Hub community, honestly, I was a little skeptical at first, because there are companies that you can just, stand up an open source community, and it's basically a proprietary tool with maybe like one or two outside developers like contributing to it. And Airflow has a huge open source community. So I kind of had high standards for what that community would be. And Data Hub has, surpassed my expectations. It's really exciting to see the energy in the community. There's a monthly town hall. So I'm just passionate about open source, and particularly how does a company come alongside an open source and contribute and invest in that open source community, so you can have a thriving open source community alongside a meaningful business. And that's what's happening at Acryl Data, and that's why I'm here.
And how does Acryl add value and monetize on top of that open source?
Yeah. So there's a lot of open source companies, and like the basics are, do you provide a managed service? And so rather than setting up all the infrastructure and owning all of that, you can just kind of click a button, it's deployed and ready to go. So kind of a SaaS model for the open source. But then there's support. So in open source, it's great. You've got documentation, you have a supportive community. But then at some point you hit a ceiling, because you want to take this thing into production. like you need business SLAs for certain use cases. And there's also mission critical use cases that I've encountered across my career where it's just a non-negotiable. There's also like the legal aspect of like, if something goes wrong with the software,
who do you point to?
Yeah. And so ultimately having a vendor partner for that is important. So all of those kind of table stakes are here at Acryl, but then there's also some really interesting things that we do on top of that I think that makes us unique. And it also, it's just different than other open source communities where sometimes there's a divide. You either, you use the open source and you say goodbye to it and goodbye to the community and you just use the SaaS, vendor. We see a lot of really active community members that also use our product. And I think that's a testament to how healthy that is. But we have, premium features on top of the open source. And we also build out, different features with our customers and we can like really collaborate with our customers. Whereas with open source is a longer process of, contributing features and it's there and it's great. But for some customers, we can really accelerate that process.
And as part of your monetization efforts at Acryl, one of the things you've done is move to the cloud marketplaces. Tell us a little bit about that and what you're doing with cloud marketplaces. Yeah.
I was first introduced to this and I didn't get it at first. So what's the point of the AWS?
You're not alone.
And I was like, people just raise a PO, like they go through a normal, like there's vendor onboarding, like you just do that. And also when introducing this to other salespeople on the team, sometimes it's like scratching your head, like, what's the point of this? And when it clicked for me, actually, I sat down at a big AWS conference, Remars, actually, the machine learning conference in Vegas a couple of years back, and actually sat down with the AWS rep and was just like, can we just go a lot deeper into what this is? And that's when it really clicked for me. And I started utilizing it every opportunity I get, because what happens is, and even if you have a champion who loves your software, to bring a software into a company, especially in enterprise, and even at smaller companies, it can be a chore. And there's security, there's procurement, there's finance, there's all these different stages in the sales process and legal as well. But what the cloud marketplace enables you to do is essentially you just get to buy software that's been approved with AWS and it becomes a line item in the AWS bill. And so from a finance perspective, from a vendor onboarding perspective, that is radically different because you're essentially riding in the wake of AWS. Obviously, the public clouds have revolutionized how people do business, and that partnership that the company already has with AWS and using their ecosystem, that has been, for all intents and purposes, stamped and approved, by the company, and so you just become part of that. That also means that you can use the standard terms from a legal perspective. And if we've, as a vendor, agreed to those terms, you're using AWS, you've also agreed to those terms. And frankly, sometimes they're better for the company. And so it streamlines that process. And we have a ton of customers that are loving the AWS ecosystem. I personally like what AWS does for the data community at large. Love the conferences that they put on. And so it's just a really easier way to procure software.
And did you consider you've got Google, GCP, Microsoft, Azure, and Amazon AWS is the three hyperscaler, really large cloud marketplaces. What did you consider those other ones, or what made you really choose AWS?
So AWS is the first choice for a lot of reasons. We see it in it's validated by our customer base. It's validated by the people that we get to work with there. And so that's definitely, on one hand, businesses, we want to be able to be as open as possible to all the different options, but AWS is number one.
Yep. And as you talk to your sales team about this and, encouraging them to use it, have you gotten any pushback, or what are the concerns that other heads of sales might hear, and how have you addressed those with your team? And I'm thinking around things like, hey, giving up margin, or, do they feel like they're losing control of the deal? What are the things you've heard, and how have you kind of responded to those with your team?
Yeah. Sometimes it's just a basic understanding of, like people will be like, oh, well, let's send them the AWS offer, and let's also send our MSA in order form. And it's like, whoa, like we don't have to do all that. We literally, it condenses it down to clicking a button. So it's really, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of, for us, we're selling to data practitioners, engineering managers, CTOs, and, they don't wake up every day and think about talking to procurement about getting software in, they're trying to add value to the business. Procurement is a forcing function for companies to be cautious and make the right decisions, like that's their job. And for the people that we sell to, like, that's not their first question of how are we doing our due diligence on a business perspective, on a legal perspective. It's generally how are we solving this technical problem that provides business value? And so at first it's a little bit of a mismatch, because this is it's a procurement avenue for software. And so the questions of, well, what about legal terms and going back and forth on that? The questions around, how do we efficiently get this implemented? The AWS Marketplace has fantastic answers for all of those questions. And so there's just concerns of I actually haven't had pushback where it's people are just against it. It's more of an understanding, because once you understand how this accelerates your deal cycle, it reduces it to the click of a button. People kind of sign up for that pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was entailed in getting set up and then managing the listing, and how do you support that ongoing with that relationship with the AWS and the marketplace?
So I'm not the listing manager. I don't want to be the listing manager. And frankly, I don't know a lot of people that wake up and want to do that either. But obviously, speaking with you, working with Clazar, in my past experience, getting an AWS marketplace offer out, it was kind of a little mysterious. And, is this, talking with sales ops, kind of managing a few different things, getting all this right information. You just get an ID code from AWS, and using your product, it was just I just filled in a couple things and I clicked a button, and I was 10 minutes later, it was ready to go. So I actually just don't worry about all of that. In a similar way, it's you want to set up Data Hub, set up all the infrastructure, work on that, or just use Acryl. It's you don't have to worry about any of those pieces.
It just works, and you don't have to worry about it.
I don't know, and I don't want to know. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
And what are some of the benefits that you've seen already, for your team and for the business so far?
So from a forecast perspective, you have typically 2 to 5 major approvals that are needed for software. And so you have to factor that into your forecast of all right, when are we going to get InfoSec? When are we going to get legal? When are we going to get financial? When are we going to get technical? And you kind of, all these aspects you've got to factor into adding additional time. Obviously in sales, we're trying to make that all parallel and move as fast as possible, but sometimes it's sequential, and that's frustrating. With AWS Marketplace, you basically cut that in half. And then you make it easier from this vendor onboarding perspective and go working with companies. So the legal part, check, you're done with that. The vendor onboarding, check, you're done with that. And so those are like the long pole in the tent most times for sales, outside of the obvious, like the technical win of like, does this actually work? And so from the procurement perspective, it just accelerates the deal. So those are the obvious, benefits. So the forecast piece, it's also just a lot more manageable. There's like less loose parts of the deal that it's like, maybe there's some stakeholder from that side of the business that had a bad morning and like wants to really be a stickler on certain questionnaire pieces. And so it's less to manage from a forecast perspective. It makes it simpler.
Yep. And you shared a story with me that like every sales leader, it's the dream, it's the nirvana. But would you mind sharing what that discovery and the deal that you came across?
Yeah. So I think for open source powered businesses like Acryl, I think Acryl is unique with our thriving community, but like broadly for open source businesses, the AWS Marketplace is the way to go because there's no paywall with open source. It's open source. You can go in, you can get it, you can evaluate it.
Yep.
And so the dream is that in the open source community, people are, without even the company knowing, because it's a community, people are talking to each other. Like all the sales research on, the amount of time it takes to actually then reach out to a salesperson and the sales process, what happens there. And so this company, and this was a healthcare company with regulations. They looked across kind of the crowded data catalog space. It's mostly proprietary vendors. And which means that there's a paywall. It's like, you've got to talk, like it's kind of difficult to actually understand the value of the product outside of like just the marketing that they have. And so this prospect, who I didn't even know was a prospect, had been doing research, was comparing, and through the research had picked Data Hub. It's the number one open source data catalog. They got to try it out. And they quickly realized, like, I love what this tool is, but I don't have time to manage it. Just the basic value of what we offer. And so they came inbound, and then a week later, after a very short conversation, they found me in the open source Slack, and they're like, "Hey, as a follow up to that, I think we're ready to go." And so, when you hear that, it's like, well, like, what do you mean? Like, sorry, but like,
define ready to go, right?
Do you have budget? Like, you go through the list. Do you have all these things? Yep. So we jump on a call, and that day. So at this point in the sales cycle, it's been like under a week because they came in on a Wednesday and we were talking on Monday, and we kind of confirm a couple things of like, hey, does this integrate with this system? Yada yada. We're the most flexible data catalog out there, so like, yes, that was easy, and was able to demo and show that. So we're on like a 20-minute call, and 15 minutes into it, we're like, great, okay, we solved that. It's that like outstanding question that you have. Let's talk about kind of pricing and how this works. So for me, I was like prepared to like go through the slides, do all the things that we do. Like, tell me more about like, how the pricing model works, pitch the whole thing.
Yep.
And I was like, can you actually share your screen? Let's see what it looks like on your side. And opens up the screen, and it said, congratulations, you purchased from the AWS Marketplace. And so that was it. It was less than a week. It's because of the power of open source, but it's also with the power of the AWS Marketplace. And so we were done. He had done his research, picked our tool, had some budget for this kind of greenfield, cloud product. Even said like, talk to some competitors, and like didn't actually get to a demo, didn't actually get to trying the product. And so we were an easy choice, and click the button. And that was it.
And that was it. Man, that's an amazing story. So Ben, I don't think we can top that. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me on.